I provided PDF copy of this these lecture slides in Google Classroom, so I wouldn't, especially the very first opening slide where we're going to define some terms, I wouldn't feel the need to write all that information down. Right? When we get to the actual, if you want to write down the information about the assignments themselves, that makes sense to me. But don't feel like, especially on this first slide, that you need to write down all these definitions. All right? So as I mentioned, on September 27th, your color wheel that you're working on, color wheel, all those charts that you're working on is due, as well as a set of color studies that you're going to do that are going to explore some things you can do with different color palettes. So we need to understand what those color palettes are. So understanding things like analogous color. When we talk about analogous color, it's a color scheme that's comprised of 3 colors that are directly next to each other on the color wheel. One color, usually a primary or secondary, is dominant while the others are supporting colors. So something like blue, blue, green, and green, right? All those are right next to each other on the color wheel. Yellow, yellow, orange, and yellow, green, those are all right next to each other on the color wheel. And in a composition maybe of blue, blue, green, and green, maybe you decide blue is your dominant color, and the blue, green, and green are the ones that sort of support it. Maybe you don't use as many instances of those colors. But all the same, that makes a very unified, harmonious palette because all the colors are very closely related. I say harmonious, to an extent harmonious. There's not a huge amount of variety, however, right? You don't have huge contrasts because all your colors are going to be fairly closely related to one another. Anomalous color allows for that variety. So an anomalous color is a color that deviates from the color scheme used throughout a composition, usually chosen from a different region of the color wheel than the other more closely related colors. I wrote that weird, so it threw me off for a sec. Incorporating an anomalous color into a color scheme can achieve emphasis or a balancing contrast. So if I had a palette of blue, blue-green, and blue-violet, all of which are very closely related, and then somewhere within my composition I also added orange. That orange would be an anomaly or an anomalous color. And it's going to want to stand out in contrast from all the others. Then a unified color palette is a color scheme in which the artist mixes a small amount of a unifying color into each of the colors chosen for a composition. Further unification can be achieved by keeping this palette limited and only mixing colors in the palette with each other, or with other colors rather in the same palette. So not bringing in any other colors at all. All right, we'll talk more in depth about what a unified color palette is because you're going to do one. Then a tone. Tone is a word that I didn't want to dive into when we were talking about the elements and principles and when we talked about color back then, because tone is a word that gets used for many different things, and so it can be problematic in art. Because we talk about tone. Tone is the word. I haven't used it yet, but tone is the word that we actually use for whether a color is warm or cool. We'll say it's cool toned or warm toned. Tone is sometimes used to just describe value. People will be talking about all the different tones of gray that you have in this. So it's a problematic term. Here we're going to just use it for describing a color that's produced either by mixing a hue with gray or by both tinting and shading at the same time. Mixing white and black, essentially mixing it with gray. It reduces chroma or the colorfulness while the hue remains unchanged. So it's not really a tint, it's not really a shade, it's a tone, because it's kind of both. It's got black and white mixed into it. All right, again, I don't feel like you've got to sit here and write all these definitions. You have them already on Google Classroom. So then, analogous color. You're going to do, one of your compositions will be an analogous color, so it's important that we kind of look at it. And as you can see here, this is exactly what an analogous color is, choosing 3 colors that are all immediately next to one another on the color wheel, and using that as your palette for whatever you might be doing. A really great artist to look at for this kind of thing is Joseph Albers. Joseph Albers did a lot of these pieces like this that were just concentric shapes. These he called homage to the square, and he numbered them like 1, 2, 3, 27, whatever. And most of them, not all, but most of them have a very limited analogous color scheme. Like this one over here, where he's using blue, violet, blue, and blue-green. Here, where he's using red, orange, orange, and yellow-orange. Over here, blue, blue-green, and green. Now, he also doesn't seem to mind mixing a little bit of white into a color if he wants it to be a bit lighter. Like he's got his blue here, and then another blue out here that he seems to have mixed white into. He's got his orange and his yellow-orange here. Well, I don't really see much in the way of any tints being made there. But that's very clearly a tint of blue up there. And Vincent van Gogh often enjoyed playing around with this as well. Now, in this one, he's got these little dabs of orange in here. But aside from that, you'll notice that both of these compositions are pretty well sticking to a color scheme that hovers around the analogous colors of blue, blue, green, and green. Not really venturing outside of that very much. Now, he uses some tints and some shades of those colors. He's certainly got some greens in here that have, I don't know how that happened, where white has been mixed into it. And he's got some blues that clearly have black mixed into them. Like there's a blue that's got some black mixed into it, right? So he's not limiting himself in that way. He's like, I can bring in tints and shades of these colors, but I'm going to keep myself limited to this analogous color scheme. Again, he breaks from that a little bit with these orange flowers over here, but for the most part, these two are really sticking to that. But then the opposite of that, again, would be incorporating into your color palette an anomalous color. Like this, where all of the colors are hovering around yellow and yellow-green, and then bam, a blue out of nowhere, right? And how once there is something like that that looks so different from everything else, our eyes can't help but be drawn to it. So it's often used for emphasis, right? It's a place where you want people to look. Or just because the entire composition feels like maybe it's getting a little too samey. So something that to be brought in there to just give the composition some contrast. So like Mark Rothko, he's working, this stuff right here he was doing in like the 50s and the 60s. These pieces where he was just playing around with, almost amorphous, fuzzy-edged squares and rectangles of different colors, because it was the color more than anything that he was interested in. And in both of these here, he's got a color scheme that's hovering around the warm end of the color wheel. Reds, oranges, red violets, things of that nature. But in both cases, he brings in an anomalous color with this blue. because that blue stands out considerably from the rest. Now, he's not necessarily using it as a point of emphasis. It doesn't really feel like he's saying, hey, this blue is the most important thing, look here. But it does provide a nice contrast that allows the whole piece to feel a bit more balanced than it would have otherwise. I like these pieces I found by this artist named Zoe Elizabeth Norman. I couldn't find titles for either of them, so I don't have those listed. She's an artist I discovered who's a landscape painter. And in both of these right here, you can see her using anomalous color, one for emphasis and the other as just a way of providing a balance and contrast. Over here, right, that splash of orange and the splash of yellow in these trees and this one are meant to draw our eye right here, because everywhere else things are pretty much blue. Maybe we dive into a little bit of violets here and there, but still very cool, where suddenly we have this warmth with these reds, oranges, and these yellowy. It looks more greenish up there, but on my screen this looks pretty yellow with maybe some greens that are in the shadow areas. Right? They provide this contrast that draws our eyes here, and then we can kind of wander through the rest of the composition. Over here, it doesn't feel like she's saying, hey, you should look here, right? Because these kind of reddish, orangey areas here, as well as these few that she's putting here, don't seem to be directing our eye to say, look here. In fact, she's even kind of crammed this over to the side and down in the corner. But they do provide a nice little balance. Because, again, everything else is green or blue, and that's it. So you bring in some small instances of color from another area of the color wheel. In her case, again, these reds and oranges. And don't put them everywhere, right? Because if they're everywhere, they just become part of the full composition of colors, of your palette, rather. But by keeping them limited, and just putting them in dots here and there, they serve as a balancing point to all of that blue and green. The unified color, this one is a bit of a newer idea for a lot of students. Unified color. Now, there are lots of ways to unify your color palette. This is one that we're going to talk about in particular. All right, so I made this little scenario. I want you to imagine that you're wanting to paint a composition of a house. And you've decided you want your grass green, you want your roof to be purple, and you want your house to be yellow. All right, and so you pick out your colors, but then when you look at them, you're like, well, actually, these look kind of horrible together. You decide, like, these look terrible. They look too contrasty. And a lot of that's because they've been chosen from 3 places at various spots around the color wheel, but not in a triad necessarily. Right? If it had been a triad, it would have been purple, green, and orange. That would have been a triad, but we've gone with yellow. But you're like, no, but I really do want a purple roof, a yellow house, and green grass. Well, what can we do? Well, to tweak these colors so that they seem harmonious, one thing that you can do, and this is what you'll do in your version, is to add a new color to each of them and unify your palette. For example, here I've taken yellow ochre and mixed a tiny bit of that yellow ochre into each of these colors here. And notice how the resulting colors still retain their chromatic nature of their original hues. You can still say that's purple, you can still say that's yellow, you can still say that's green. But they now appear more closely related to each other and therefore more harmonious. Because again, we talked about how variety and unity, when combined, can create harmony. In this particular case, the variety is coming from 3 colors that have been chosen from widely different places on the color wheel. The unity comes from adding a consistent single color to each of these, resulting in a color palette that now feels harmonious. And I could paint with this, and I'm still going to have a purple roof, I'm still going to have a yellow house, I'm still going to have green grass, but they're going to all feel like they belong together and not like they're from wildly contrasting areas of the color wheel. So somebody like Jenny Saville does this kind of thing all the time, where in this image over here, she's got kind of this bluish color that's mixed into everything. Even where colors might seem warm, they've been muted slightly by this bluish tint. Over here, it's even more pronounced that she's using kind of this minty green color, and it's mixed into everything. Every single color that we see, even where it feels like there's a really saturated red, when we really pay attention to it, that red isn't as like starkly red as it could be, because she's mixed a tiny dab of this mint green into it, neutralizing it ever so slightly. Excuse me. In both cases, she's using tints and shades excuse me, of her colors, but in every single color that she's put down, she has included a small dab of some other color, some other consistent color, to keep all of those unified looking and harmonious as a result. Paul Klee, we mentioned him the other day. Excuse me, I don't know where this is coming from all of a sudden. This piece, the red balloon, and this piece, the affected place. Paul Klee was all about exploring color and all the possibilities of it. And one of the things he would do would be to unify his palettes by mixing certain colors into every color in the palette to make them all feel like they're in the same family. So here, he's got a lot of different colors that are going on in here, but in every single one, he has mixed this yellow color. So that even in an area where probably he had maybe a purple in these areas, the yellow is muting those colors down. Over here, all of his colors have been muted a bit, because it looks again like he may have mixed a little bit of yellow into each color. It allows for that red to want to stand out, but if we were to take just a drop of it, we might notice that it's more orange in nature. All of the colors appear just a bit muted, but they all still read as the color they were originally, whether that be green, purple, blue, red. But he's got a little bit of an additional color mixed in there. Then tones. Right, remember, if we have a pure color or a hue, we've already talked about tints and shades. That's when you mix black into the color to make a shade. Mix white into a color to make a tint. A tone comes from mixing gray into your hue. And artists have used this to great effect over the centuries. A particularly great one is James Abbott McNeill Whistler. Whistler often even titled his paintings like they were musical compositions, like a harmony in gray and green, nocturne, blue and gold. They would often have these musical terminology that paid a certain amount of homage to the harmony that he was trying to create by only using tones oftentimes. Rarely in Whistler's paintings is there good, strong, saturated color. But when looking at his paintings, because every single color is a tone, it's amazing how things can seem like they're saturated. It can seem like she's got very red-colored lips. We could pick out yellows and greens and things that we would point to. We could pick out blues and yellows in this image over here. But if we ever could ever get a drop of each color, we would notice just how gray they all look. This one by Giorgio Morandi. These are some pieces that he did. He's got a ton of these that he did that are just little, simple, still lives of different objects that he would grab around his house and set up, and he would paint them only in tones. But again, the amazing thing is, when you have a tone just by itself, and you have no other colors to compare it to, it just looks gray. But every tone still maintains a little bit of its chromatic nature that it got from the hue that was mixed into it. So that if you put nothing but tones next to one another, there are these beautiful little subtle things that can happen with color. So that we can look at this and say, that looks very clearly yellow. No doubt about it, that is yellow. And we look at this and we're like, no doubt about it, that is blue. We look at this and this seems very much like a reddish orange. That background back there looks kind of greeny yellow. But if we ever pick the specific colors themselves, we realize they're very desaturated. That blue that we read so much as blue right there is actually very gray. And believe me, those two don't even look the same to you right now, but I swear to you, I literally picked the color from one pixel that was right there. And that's the color it came up with. This right here that looks so saturated yellow to us when it's here, you see is a very dull, almost yellow ochre, but even more dull than yellow ochre. And again, I picked it by picking the color of one specific pixel right there. But that's kind of the beauty of what tones can do. We can have these very muted colors. They can create a mood. Whoop, did not mean to do that. They can create a mood, which is very much what Whistler's all about. Whistler's wanting you to feel sort of somber. Some of his stuff is meant to make you feel kind of depressed. Here, it's not necessarily being used for that, but there's sort of a mood, right? The light is not particularly bright and sunny here. And yet we can still read all those colors as if they were super bright and vibrant. So what you're going to do is you're going to design a composition, one that's not too complex. Don't try to make yourself something that's going to take a lot of time to create each time, because you're going to do this 4 times. You're going to repeat that composition. It would not be a bad idea to create something that can be executed in like 3 or 4 colors. And you're going to execute it 4 different times. Oh, also, you'll note, we looked at artists who were working very representationally, we looked at artists who were working abstractly, and we looked at artists who were non-representational. Paul Klee and Mark Rothko, for example, right? Just working with shapes and colors. So your composition can be any of those. It doesn't have to be something representational. We don't have to look at it and say, oh yeah, I see that dog in your picture. But if that's what you want, that's fine too. All right, the first one will be a palette of 3 analogous colors of your choice. The second will be a color palette with 1 anomalous color. So all your colors should be fairly closely related, and then there's suddenly one that's very different that stands out. Third is a palette of no more than 5 colors, right? So up to 5 that are unified by mixing the same color into each one. I don't want you to go over 5. I mean, don't just have 1. That doesn't help. But, 2, 3, 4, or 5 is fine. And lastly, a color palette consisting only of tones, hues that are mixed with gray. But again, every single one should be the same composition. So in going back to our example of making a composition of a house, if I decide my composition is a house sitting next to a tree in a big open field, every single one of those should be that same house, same field, same tree. But I have to use different colors for each one. Does that make sense? Okay. For each of the color studies, I want you to tape off about a 1/2-inch border on all 4 sides. So there's a white strip surrounding them when you turn it in. And in studies number 1 and 2, the analogous and the anomalous color, I don't mind if you also bring in tints and shades of your colors that you've chosen. That's okay. But no pure black or pure white can come into those. And honestly, you might want to avoid pure white and pure black in 3 and 4 as well. But here, I want you to not even worry with tints and shades. Whatever colors you mix to make these two, stick to those colors. Don't bring white or black into that. Your materials for this, you need 4 sheets of 11 by 14 Bristol board. Down here at the very end of the table, there's a stack of them. So make sure you grab 4 of those before you leave. Your acrylic paint, a pencil to draw out your composition, masking tape. If you don't have masking tape, I've got tape here that you can use whenever you're in classroom. And both this and that color wheel and all those colored charts, all that assignment, those are all due September 27th. Questions about this at all? Okay. So you guys have about 22-ish minutes that you can work. I'll stop this and I'll turn the lights on so that you can see what you're doing.